Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American origins and institutional processes. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this program. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Good afternoon and welcome to another edition, another week of our conversation here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It's a pleasure to be with you as it always is. I trust, I hope that your weekend went well. Mine did, and I am grateful for every one of those experiences, as I think we all are. We're anticipating the winter weather here in Appalachia, but so far we've been very fortunate. We've had temperatures, a little bit warmer than we might expect this time of year, and I'm getting the feeling as I watch national forecasts, however, that this is going to change. So it's important to enjoy it while we have it. I welcome you to today's program. It'll be a continuation of what we began last week, which is a look at Mark Levin's book entitled "The Liberty Amendments," and I think an important issue here. I purchased Mark Levin's book toward the end of last week, and I have it on a Kindle. So I'm opening my Kindle and firing up. So a little bit intimidated by technology, but I think that's the generation that I come from more than anything else. Let me encourage you, if you have comments or suggestions and you'd like to share them with me. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. And I wanted to kind of share with you a little bit of information before we begin. We talked here at the Virtual Center some time ago about a class that I was planning to do beginning this fall for local high school students here in southern West Virginia, in the particular county that we're in here in southern West Virginia, which is Raleigh County. We have 5 high schools, including what the Academy for Careers and Technology, which is the modern name for what used to be called vocational schools. We have an excellent one here in Raleigh County. It's super. And we want to include those folks in this course because, again, it's not only going to be focused on the content related to the founding, but it's also going to be a skill development experience, I hope, for the students. And what I've been doing last week and then this morning, I had my last 2 appointments. I have a good friend in the school board office who's been going around from school to school with me. And what we've been doing is identifying an on-site teacher who will kind of be the point man or woman, as the case may be. And in one of our high schools, it is indeed a woman, one of the best teachers I've ever come across in a long, long time, Karen Matson. But anyway, I've been visiting the high schools and handing out some literature that I put together on this program as to what I intended it to be. And this morning was our last visit. We now have visited all 5 high schools, and at Miller Hall, my friend in the board office is going to arrange for me to be on the agenda at the next board meeting of the school board, and we're going to make members of the school board aware of the fact that we're going to launch this thing early in November. And what we'll be doing over the next couple of weeks is getting the information out to parents. And again, I have really strongly made the point to in each of the schools that I visited that I really don't anticipate this as being a traditional course in the traditional sense. And what I mean by that is, besides a number of we're not going to use a textbook. We're going to use only primary documents. The a student's going to be asked to read critically and write extensively, and do research on the internet and all of those things, because it is first and foremost a skill-based course. It's not aimed at the upper echelon of the graduating senior population in our county. It's aimed at high school juniors and seniors who aren't sure whether they want to go to college or not. And I know we talked about this some weeks ago here at the Virtual Center, but I just kind of wanted to bring you up to date. One of the things that principal this morning made, which I thought was a very good point, is that it sounded to him, and indeed it's true, that this course, because of its emphasis on skills as well as content, would probably be a great asset to students, juniors, who are preparing to take the ACT, the college entrance exams. And of course I pointed out that it would be, because it's going to stress a little bit about test-taking skills, but it's also going to emphasize the idea of critical reading and comprehension and those kinds of things. So it'll be very appropriate in the ACT test that students take for college, because if you remember, or if you're familiar, the ACT test features paragraphs with comprehension questions following the paragraphs, and of course students are timed, and they're under the clock, so to speak, under the gun, and so it really puts a premium on reading comprehension and understanding and reading between the lines and picking up on inferences and those kinds of things. It's just not information based, and that's the whole point of this experience. So I just wanted folks here at the Virtual Center, you all, to know that that we are indeed launching this program probably in about 3 weeks, probably the first weekend in November. We're going to run right through to the spring, to the end of the school year. I will be visiting, each week I will be visiting a different high school class. Of course, they'll all be meeting at different times, because I have asked each teacher who will participate in this to schedule the meetings at the most appropriate time for students. And that does not necessarily mean that all of them will be at the same time. While the county is well managed and well organized, it's not in lockstep to that degree that every bell rings at the same time. I can't say this without sharing with you a memory that I have, and it's a distant one now. But when I was in college, I was in a teacher education program. I was securing my teaching degree in history and social studies, and this was in 1964, actually. And I did my practice teaching in what is now a middle school. At that time, we used to call them junior high schools in the city of Boston. And I was assigned, and I think I put in 8 weeks of on-site, and I worked with a cooperating teacher whom I remember very, very well. And one of the things that amazed me was that, as large as the Boston school system is, the fact of the matter is the schools were so well synchronized that all the junior high schools at that time, middle schools now, all the junior high schools used to be on the same bell schedule, and the break times were the same, the lunch times were the same. It was so coordinated, and it used to occur to me during the bathroom breaks when boys and girls were allowed to go to the restroom. They were given a break between, I believe, second and third period, when they could have a bathroom break. And I can remember it occurring to me. Now, this again was 1964, so this is a long time ago. This is 50 years ago. It just amazed me to think that every youngster, every middle school youngster in grades 7, at that time 7, 8, and 9. Now middle schools are 6, 7, and 8. But at that time our junior high schools were 7, 8, and 9. That every youngster in the 7th, 8th, and 9th grade in the city of Boston was going to the bathroom at the same time. It used to amaze me that the schools were so synchronized, and of course it wasn't too long being in the classroom before I began to realize that perhaps there was a little bit too much of that kind of synchronization and a little bit too little of the kinds of things that would allow students to prosper and flourish as part of their education experience. But be that as may, I just wanted you to know that this program is getting off the ground, and we'll be I'll be working with the teachers each week for approximately an hour. We'll try to do it on the internet. Hopefully that'll work. We'll select a time which will be convenient, and then we will then they will meet with the students in their school for what looks like 75-minute after-school time. It's looking like it'll probably be an after-school experience. I don't know which day of the week. It pretty much depends on the individual school. But the thinking was that the class with the students would meet for approximately 75 minutes, which would be time to do document analysis and all the rest of it. Students would be writing extensively and would be asked asked the kind of questions of the documents they're reading, which will take them way beyond the printed word into the idea of intent and assumptions and context and all the other things that contribute to one's understanding of a particular historical period. In this case, it'll be the period of America's founding. And so we'll begin with the colonial period, and we'll look at the charters, and we'll look at the Mayflower Compact and the Dorchester Agreement and John Winthrop's speeches and some of the things that we've dealt with here at the Virtual Center, because I really think that they're very, very valuable conceptually for the kinds of issues that they present and the kind of abstract thinking that I anticipate that these documents will generate among students. My guess is that these high school juniors and seniors probably haven't had as much exposure to abstract thinking as they're going to have. And I really believe that as far as college prep is concerned, I really believe that that's kind of the missing element. I've become very much an advocate, and I don't want to go off on a tangent here because I don't want to lose the sight of our program. But in the years that I've been here in West Virginia, which I've been here for 22 years, and in fact I came here to teach in 1971. I was here for 5 years, then I left for 15, then I came back, and I've been here 22 more years. So I've been in West Virginia, southern West Virginia, for all practical purposes for close to 30 years. And like many places that I think we all know about, West Virginians are very, very proud of where they live and of their fellow beings and all of this. And you know, they're very, and it's very important that they are proud of it, because very honestly, in the national media, West Virginia periodically takes terrible beatings. Takes some terrible beatings. It seems like sometimes the media likes to focus on the most negative aspects of West Virginia. And part of that, I think, is the reason why in the 30 years that I've been here, I've become a real advocate, not only for the state, but more importantly for the people of the state and the youngsters of the state. And one of the things I know from having taught here that many years is that West Virginians do not lack one whit of the intelligence that students bring to the table anywhere else. If they lack anything, it's sophistication and skills. They have the intelligence. They can do it if somebody will show them how. And that's really what I see as the real driving force behind this initiative. I want to see West Virginians compete and compete successfully with young people around the country, because my sense is, my feeling is, my hope is that the rest of the country will begin to appreciate West Virginians once they become more competitive and they're out there in the national workforce and they're doing great things, and they begin to develop the kinds of skills and the kinds of efficiencies and attitudes that will complement their innate ability. And so, that this is as much as anything else what's driving me. It's in part a mission on my part, and I'm very, very excited about it. And that's one of the reasons I want to share it with you, because I want folks who join us here regularly at the Virtual Center to know exactly what's going on, what I hope to accomplish, not only with the program each day, but also in education and in the classroom, and looking towards the nation's future. And speaking of the nation's future, of course, and this kind of gets us into our program, we've obviously, for obvious reasons, we've been dealing with the shutdown. We know that this Thursday looms the potential of a default on the nation's debt if something isn't done. President Obama today, in visiting a food, I believe it was a food pantry, if I'm not mistaken, made the point that there is indeed a serious threat of default if the leaders in Congress are not able to reach an agreement. And of course, the word that's been coming out of Washington today is that it does appear that that Senator Reid and Senator McConnell, the leaders of the two parties in the Senate, are coming closer and closer and closer to some sort of an agreement, some sort of a deal. And of course, the question is, whatever the Senate passes on a bipartisan basis is going to have to make it through the House, which is controlled by the Republican Party. So that is by no means a done deal. And the fact of the matter is there has not been a vote on the shutdown in the House. The thinking has been that between, with Democrats in the House, along with moderate and concerned conservative Republicans who clearly are not in favor of the shutdown, it has occurred to many people that if an up or down vote was taken in the House, there's every reason to believe that the shutdown would have ended earlier than now. But that Speaker Boehner has refused to allow that kind of a vote, in part out of deference to the group that is really driving the shutdown and driving the strategy, if you can call it a group. I'm not sure exactly what the appropriate word is. But anyway, there's no question that this issue needs to be addressed. It's being addressed everywhere. Everybody's talking about it on every talk show, every program this weekend, the Sunday morning news programs and interview programs focused on nothing else. There was a demonstration in Washington, D.C. this week, as I believe Bob Kincaid kind of hinted last week, indicated that there was a planned Tea Party demonstration of sorts in Washington, D.C. this week, and it happened. I don't think it made anywhere near the kind of splash that it promised to make. A couple of articles in the Washington Post today raised questions about, which I think are very appropriate questions, about how quickly the police were to arrest the Occupy folks, if you remember, several months ago, who were protesting the recession and the rumored favorable treatment of banks and finance companies and all the rest of it, and hedge fund managers and everything else. And the Occupy folks were, the police were quick to strike, but the question was raised, where were they this weekend? Apparently there was a little bit of property disruption and dislocation in Washington around the World War II memorial. And the question is, why is it that the police were so quick to arrest certain people and not others, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? But the fact of the matter is, it didn't have nearly the impact that it was anticipated that it might have. But if you remember last week, what we were looking at is a book that came out in August by Mark Levin, the talk show host, the conservative talk show host, the title of which is the Liberty Amendments. And basically the point that I made here, and I've gotten a lot of reaction to our programs last week about this, the basic gist of the book put out by Levin is that the 11 amendments to the Constitution that he proposes would be, in effect, would be the agenda should a constitutional convention be convened. And Levin's book is written in the context of a serious look at Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States, which spells out the two ways that amendments can be proposed and the two ways that amendments can be approved or ratified. One of them has always been used. One of them has never been used. And the idea of two-thirds of the states requesting that Congress call for a constitutional convention has never been used. And that's the strategy that Mark Levin is proposing. And his basic premise is that the agenda that he and his Tea Party supporters are advocating is an agenda which suggests that rather looking at taking over Congress and affecting change from the top down, the operative strategy that seems to be most appealing to conservatives is the one of requesting a constitutional convention by two-thirds of the states. And one of the most telling facts of the game, it seems to me, is the fact that we have had a substantial number of states who are under the control of Republicans, legislatures, and governors. 26 states have consciously opted out of, refused to participate in the president's health care plan. And we talked a little bit last week about what the implication of that is for health care. Because it so happens that many of these states are in the Deep South, and it so happened that about 60% of the target population who would benefit most from the president's health care proposals, the Affordable Care Plan, live in these states. So in a sense, what we have is a situation where national legislation that was passed in order to benefit 60%, the poorest 60% of our working population, is the people in these states are being denied access to health care because of the actions of the governors and the legislatures in their states. And that is a topic worthy of discussion, and I know it's getting a lot of discussion. Because it appears that a significant number of the people who help, for whom help was the original intent behind the Affordable Care Act, are not going to be able to benefit from it, at least initially. But the point that we've stressed here is what that number of 26 states means in terms of the Constitution of the United States and the method outlined there for ratifying that Constitution. If a constitutional convention can be proposed by two-thirds of the states, that effectively means 34 states would have to call for it. It's pretty obvious that there are 26 states right now that would call for it, which means that we're looking at fewer than 10 states more to go in order to issue a call for a constitutional convention, which would be consistent with Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States. At the beginning of the programs last week, we were speculating on that as being the likely agenda of conservatives and strategists who are really driving the Tea Party initiative. And if you remember, we looked at an article that appeared early last week in the New York Times about the big money that's bankrolling this whole initiative. But with the awareness of Mark Levin's book on the Liberty Amendments, it's very clear that his book is written with that particular strategy in mind, and he speaks straight up about the fifth article of the Constitution and the strategy open to conservatives for amending the Constitution. Consequently, the 11 amendments that he proposes in his book called the Liberty Amendments effectively become the agenda for those who would be responsible for convening a constitutional convention and ultimately, I think, doing serious damage potentially to the nation. It's very interesting. I've been, as I mentioned, I've been reading Mark Levin's book. I'm about a third of the way through it. And one of the issues that he addresses very, very early on is fear of a runaway convention, is fear that once you bring people together in a constitutional convention, everything is on the table. The entire Constitution is back on the table. And he denies that and says basically that the way he reads the fifth article of the Constitution, the amendment article, because a convention would be called with particular amendments in mind, therefore those amendments would become a legitimate constraint on the members of the Constitution. They couldn't veer into other areas and do other things. And of course, my concern, in fact, not just my concern, a concern about a constitutional convention throughout our history has been the fact that once you put all of these things back on the table, there's serious question as to whether the Bill of Rights as we know it would even pass today. There's serious questions, and we've seen some of the issues that have become, that have become kind of the sparks in some of our most heated political debates through the years. And potentially all of these things would be on the table at a constitutional convention. And one of the things I've learned, and I guess I'm taking issue with Mark Levin here, but one of the things I've learned over the years is that there's a real difference between denying and refuting something. It's one thing to say, well, it potentially could happen, but it won't. There's quite a bit of difference between that and being able to point to something in the Constitution which says there's no way this could happen because it is specifically or expressly prohibited in the Constitution. And that is not there. And I have read and reread Article 5, and I personally am very hard put to find where in Article 5 there would be the kinds of constraints on a constitutional convention that Mark Levin pretty much reassures people that will be there, that would be in operation. In other words, his position is that if there was a constitutional convention, its role, its agenda would be clearly defined, and those who attended the convention would not be able to veer away from that agenda. I don't see that kind of limitation. It seems to me that the best example that we have to go by is the first Constitutional Convention, which convened in May of 1787. And one of the first things that occurs when there is when a quorum is reached and the Constitutional Convention is gavelled into session late in May of 1787, the most telling, it seems to me the most telling thing is right out of the chute, those who have been most instrumental in bringing the Constitutional Convention into being in the first place, immediately take over and shift the focus of the convention from the original call. The delegates were appointed or chosen to represent their states in a convention, the purpose of which was to revise the Articles of Confederation. But in the first speech to the assembled delegates, Governor Randolph of Virginia makes the case, and makes a very solid case, that the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation as written, has so many flaws that he and others believe that revision of the Articles of Confederation is not possible. And he suggests that what we're really dealing with here is to scrap them and to replace them with a totally new form of government. And from that, the Virginia Plan is distributed, and the Virginia Plan becomes the focus of debate of the convention from that time on. And, you know, many of you know from our days in school that the small states become very, very concerned because the Virginia Plan seems to suggest an opportunity for the largest, most populous states to control the Union: Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York. And many of the smaller states become very uptight by this because they're really concerned that because they don't have the population that the larger states have, they will be almost second-class citizens in a revised union. And so they come up with what history refers to as the New Jersey Plan. And it is intended principally to maintain the structure of the Articles of Confederation, where each state has one vote. Each state is only as powerful as every other state. And under the Articles, while each state can have anywhere from 2 to 5 delegates representing it, the fact of the matter is the state can only vote once. And so it's up to the delegates to work out the differences between them so that when they cast the state's vote, it's one vote. And so this protects the smaller states, the equality and the power of the smaller states. And so therefore they want to preserve this in the New Jersey Plan. And from that comes what the textbooks refer to as the Great Compromise. And, you know, I don't think it's necessary to say that it is not historically accurate to label it the Great Compromise. The reason it's called the Great Compromise is because those who write the history books believe that this compromise was a very positive, good thing. So for them it was great. It made the convention possible. It made the Constitution possible. But the compromise was that there would be a 2-house legislature and that the lower house, the House of Representatives, would be based on population. The largest states would have the most congressmen and therefore the most votes in the House. But in the Senate, each state would have 2 senators. Therefore, there would be equality in the Senate. And many of us can appreciate the fact that throughout the period from ratification of the Constitution all the way up until the southern states begin to secede from the Union with the election of Abraham Lincoln in November of 1860, the South's whole strategy is to maintain equality in the Senate because it effectively gives them a veto. Since all legislation must pass both houses, just talked a few moments ago about that in terms of reaching a compromise on this shutdown. The Senate can reach a compromise. They can craft a bill, but in order to become law, it has to pass the House of Representatives as well. And so because a piece of legislation, in order to become law and go to the President's desk for signature, must pass both houses of the legislature, Congress and the Senate, by maintaining an equal voice, an equal number of votes in the Senate, 2 senators per state, the South effectively has a veto over national policy. And, of course, what they're most protective of is the institution of slavery. And so they become absolutely determined throughout the early 19th century to maintain equality in terms of the number of states, because by maintaining the same number of slave states as free states, they are maintaining an equal number of senators, and therefore, as long as the senators continue to vote together as a bloc, they can effectively have veto power over national legislation. So what in reality we have in the early 19th century in the American political system is minority government. It's very interesting that James Madison in the Federalist Papers, in Federalist 58, talks about the issue of minority government. And it's very telling today, because that's what we've got today with the shutdown. We have one small, tightly knit faction of about 80 members of Congress in the House of Representatives who are effectively holding the rest of the government hostage during this crisis. So the idea of minority government is very real. It's happening right now. Madison addressed this in the Federalist Papers in number 58. And he made the point, which I think is very, very important to consider, given who Madison was and what he wanted at the time. He is very, very understanding and appreciative of the arguments of those who are arguing for minority government. The idea being, those people that advocate it argue that everybody knows that there are certain people who are much more qualified and much more intelligent, much more capable, and much more involved in the day-to-day operations of government than are others. And so their position is that the people who are most intelligent, who are most literate, who are most concerned, who have the biggest stake in society, the most to lose, they are the ones who really ought to have more say in what government does than those who do not own property or do not have. And this, of course, becomes a real issue in the early 19th century when property qualifications are dropped for voting and office holding in many states during the so-called Jackson period, which is considered to be a period of a tremendous spurt of democracy in America. One of the major changes is the shelving of property qualifications for voting office holding in state after state after state. And so the fear is that allows people to vote who don't have a vested interest, who don't have the kind of education and the kind of experience, and who don't have the kind of cosmopolitan worldview that many of the political leaders of the country have. And so they make a very, very impassioned case at the time of the Constitution that their will ought to exceed the will of the majority because they are the ones who really know. Madison, in Federalist 58, makes a very, very impassioned plea and recognizes and gives them a lot of credit for that and says he understands very well where they're coming from and why they're doing it. But the fact of the matter is, he points out, you can't have, in a republic, you cannot have minority government. You cannot have it. And so, in effect, Madison's Federalist 58 historically is one of the major arguments, one of the major documents that ought to be talked about more and more and more during this shutdown. Because effectively that's what we've got, is minority government. And what basically this small group of people is saying is, if we don't get our way and the majority is unwilling to do anything about Obamacare, we'll bring the government down. We'll basically cause the default. And of course there are speeches and op-ed pieces appearing all over the country which are suggesting in the minds of many people that maybe a default might be a good thing. It'll shake people up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I think it's very, very important to know that Madison himself addressed the issue of minority government, and that is effectively what we are witnessing right now with the shutdown and the potential default on our debts and all the rest of it. So history continues to, if we will just learn from it and use it, these people were incredibly intelligent and incredibly visionary and insightful. They were able to anticipate a lot of the things that we currently experience and have experienced in the recent past. And there's a lot of lessons learned, and there's a lot of wisdom in what these people say if we will just consult it. Of course, unfortunately, what we tend to do is listen to those whose ideology we most agree with, and we allow them to tell us what's there or what's not there, rather than knowing it for ourselves. Anyway, we are at 41 minutes after the hour, and one of the things that I was very, very adamant about the last time we were together last Wednesday is that I wanted to get my hands on Mark Levin's book, and I wanted to look at these amendments. I kind of had an idea as to what they might be, but I wanted to look at them because effectively what the 11 amendments are in this book is an agenda should a constitutional convention ever be convened. This is the game plan. This is the agenda. This is really the end game for these folks. And I think it's very, very important to know it, because I really think that if you don't have specifics, it becomes very difficult to get people concerned about something when you don't have any specifics. And you say, well, if there would happen to be a constitutional convention called, what would limit it? What would happen to our Bill of Rights? What would happen to separation of church and state? What would happen to religious freedom in our society? What would happen, to women's rights and women's right to choose, and all these other things that are the product of Supreme Court decisions and various other things? And what you usually get, if you don't have any specifics on which to hang your hat, then people say, oh, you're just fear-mongering and you're just trying to frighten people and stampede people into action and stuff. You don't have any specifics. You don't have any raw data. Well, I would suggest to you that these 11 amendments, in my mind, constitute raw data. And I think by looking at and understanding these 11 amendments, we can pretty well get our arms around what the agenda of these folks is all about. So with that, I would like to spend the balance of our program today looking at Mark Levin's Liberty Amendments. And of course, the subtitle of his book is related to something like retaking control, the implication being that we have lost control, that the Constitution has been lost. And so what, in theory, what these amendments are doing is laying out a plan whereby the Constitution can be recovered from those who, over the years, as government's power and cost has continued to increase, those who have basically undone the beauty and the substance of the Constitution of the United States. So this is painted, these Liberty Amendments are painted as a very, very conservative thing, kind of like Jefferson at the time of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, if you read his declaration very carefully, it's very obvious that he is making the case to the world that in this controversy between the American colonies and Great Britain, Britain is the aggressor, not the colonists. The colonists are the unfortunate victims of a monarchical government that has gone mad. That's effectively what Jefferson is suggesting in the Declaration. So in effect, then, if you read it and you accept it for what it says, then in reality the colonists become not revolutionaries, not radicals, but reluctant conservative people who are left no option except to go for independence, because that's the only way that they can recover the inalienable rights that have been taken from them by an oppressive government, by an oppressive king. That's effectively the strategy that Mark Levin is using in his book. What he's suggesting is the Constitution, as it was originally written, has been corrupted. And so he feels that these amendments are the strategy, the game plan, by which the original intent of the founders can be recovered and restored. So in a sense, we are not the radicals. It's those that have put us in this position who are the radicals. We're the conservatives. We're the ones that are just trying to maintain our own rights and our own freedoms. Hence the title, The Liberty Amendments. The implication is our liberty is being taken from us, and we need to recover it. So it's an effort to paint the current political situation in the same context as Jefferson was sketching in his Declaration of Independence. So with that, I've turned to the appendix, and what you find is that in Mark Levin's book, each chapter, well, of course the first chapter, and then there's an epilogue, but each chapter focuses on one of 11 amendments. So if you look at the table of contents is effectively the title of each chapter of his book is the title of one of the 11 amendments. So that's what I wanted to spend time on today, is looking at these amendments, because this is the hard data. This is the stuff that it seemed to me we all must have in order to confront and counter those who, I believe, would do serious damage to our constitutional system. Amendment number 1, an amendment to establish term limits for members of Congress. Not a surprise. Term limits have been discussed for how long? How many years have we seen and heard arguments about the idea of term limits? I'm suggesting to you that if you think about the discussions and the debates and the conversations we've had in the media in recent years about term limits, you have effectively read the first chapter of Mark Levin's book, because his first chapter goes all the way back and takes us through the issue of term limits from the founders, from the Constitutional Convention, right up to the present, and points out that at certain times during our history, when it looks like we're veering away from the Constitution, thoughtful people have suggested that the way to get a handle on this and the way to curb the abuses to our political system is to enforce or implement term limits on members of Congress. There's absolutely no question that there's some validity to this. I don't think, I think sometimes we get so caught up in ideological discussion and debate that we tend to assume that everybody that doesn't agree with us on certain things is wrong on everything. And of course, the other side of that coin is we tend to assume that everybody who does agree with us is right about everything. And we know realistically that that's not true. Fact of the matter is, the founders, you can find all sorts of evidence in quotes, and he includes a number of these quotes in his first chapter. You can find example after example of people during the founding who were very, very concerned about the threat of those who represented their states and the people of the states in the new central government. The fear was that once they left their state and went to the national capital, and of course there was a big political debate over where that was going to be, they would lose touch with the people who sent them there. And that if they continued to be elected and reelected, fact of the matter is they would cease to be first and foremost representatives of their own states or representatives of the people of congressional districts within their own states. And instead, they would have adopted a totally different self-interested agenda. And their ability to represent the needs and interests of the people who sent them there would be compromised. There's absolutely no question that you can find. I've seen letter after letter, position paper after position paper in favor of term limits because, in fact, there's no question that when a person is elected and reelected to the same office over and over again, there is this natural tendency to assume that that job, that office, becomes your private property. It's not public service that the people have called you to perform. It's a job which I have had for so long that I look upon it as my own job. And therefore, my number one priority is to basically do that job in the best way as it suits me, not so much in the way that it might serve or benefit my constituents. And so the ability of constituents to be heard and for the needs to be known to the representative becomes less and less real as the representative spends less and less time back in their home districts. And there's no question that we see this all the time. And so I would suggest to you that this amendment to establish term limits is very understandable, it's very predictable, and it's not something that you can just counter out of, automatically and say because of the people that propose it, it's not valid. The fact of the matter is there's an awful lot to this amendment which makes a lot of sense to a lot of people. Mark Levin not only names the amendment, but he basically spells out the wording of the amendment. Section 1. No person may serve more than 12 years as a member of Congress, whether such service is exclusively in the House or the Senate or combined in both houses. In other words, if you are elected either a representative or a Senate or both at different times, the total number of years that you can serve in the central government representing your state and the people of your state is 12. How would you implement that? Section 2. Upon ratification of this article, any incumbent member of Congress whose term exceeds the 12-year limit shall complete the current term, but thereafter shall be ineligible for further service as a member of Congress. One of the most fascinating discussions that you can find in the period during ratification of the Constitution, Gordon Wood does an awful lot with this in his Radicalism in the American Revolution, are those people who believe that public service necessarily means that those elected to serve should not be paid. The general belief was, and this, if you think about it, is very idealistic, but the idea is what's going to cause representatives or senators more than anything else to lose touch with the people who sent them there is an income, is a salary. And their position in the abstract is that public service ought to be just that, public service. It ought not to be a paid job, because if it becomes a paid job, then not only is the inclination there to increase your own salaries, but also this idea that this is yours and it belongs to you and you're being paid for doing it is much more difficult to combat. And so there's an awful lot of writing during the period of the founding, during the period of the Revolution and immediately after that, about public service and how public service necessitates that people not be paid. The general thinking was that public service needs to be just that, public service. But those who argued for it recognized that pretty well would determine who your representatives would be and who they would not be. Because obviously there's a whole group of people the majority of the people, who could not afford to leave their homes for months at a time to represent the people in their congressional district or in their state in a far-off capital. And the only way that they could serve is to be paid. So if you insist literally that public servants not be paid, then by definition you are suggesting that only the wealthy, only the well-heeled, only the people who do not need the income ought to be eligible of holding the position. The founders were very aware of that. And so it doesn't take very long before salaries begin to be assigned to this. One of the most glaring examples of this is during the ratification debates of the Constitution, when the ratification conventions were being held in the states. Most states made an effort to try to hold the convention in a place that was most convenient to most people, toward the center of the state or in the major cities or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, it was a hardship for a lot of these people who were elected as convention delegates to go there and spend day after day after day, leave their families and their farms and all the rest of it. It was very, very difficult. And so many of the states' legislatures approved pay for these elected delegates. And there was a lot of debate about that. That generated a lot of debate about how public service, by definition, ought not to constitute a salary, ought not to generate a salary. Because the next thing from a salary is the idea that this is mine, this is my property, I own it, it's a job. And that violates the whole spirit of republicanism as a form of government. This is the First Amendment that Mark Levin proposes. His first chapter, or actually his second chapter, but the First Amendment is a chapter about the idea of term limits for members of Congress. Please be aware that Mark Levin did not write this book in a historical vacuum. This is a book that is a product of and a function of the current political situation in America. If you call a convention and you impose term limits, a maximum of 10 years, then what you are effectively calling for is a house cleaning of the Congress of the United States right now. The people that have been there the longest would go. The people that are the newest would stay. Obviously, it's important to realize who that would mean and who it would not mean. When you consider the gerrymandered districts that we talked about earlier during this shutdown and the number of these Tea Party people who have been put up as candidates in order to defeat the traditional political leadership of the Republican Party in a lot of areas because they were considered to be not conservative enough, then what you realize is that there's already been a substantial amount of house cleaning in the Congress of the United States already. This amendment would essentially get rid of the rest. It would get rid of most of the political experience and wisdom that currently exists in the Congress of the United States. And it would suggest that you would have a House of Representatives and a Senate which would be manned, each house would be manned by people with not a lot of political experience, which would mean that they would be very vulnerable to being told what to do and how to vote and how not to vote by those with the most influence in society, i.e. big money. this amendment, effectively applied right now, would generate a situation where the Congress of the United States would be under the thumb of the Koch brothers and some of these organizations which have emerged in the last couple of years that are raising tens of millions of dollars that are driving this shutdown and driving an advertising campaign and a campaign on America's campuses, which is well orchestrated and not well understood. This amendment, just this one, there are 11, just this one would effectively do that. It is the top of the hour. We have completed our first hour here at the Virtual Center. We're going to pause and take a 4 or 5 minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll go right back to Mark Levin's amendments, and we'll see how many of them we can get through in our next hour. I'm Bill O'Brien. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to today's program of the Virtual Center. This is our second hour. If you're just joining us, welcome. If you've been with us through our first hour, thank you for staying with us. We are looking at the 11 amendments in Mark Levin's book, The Liberty Amendments, on the premise, which I think is a good one, that were there to be a constitutional convention called, these 11 amendments would be the agenda, would be the game plan, or the end game, if you will, of those most responsible for calling the Constitutional Convention. The fact of the matter is, this strategy, this approach, has never been used. The founders were very, very concerned about the dangers of calling a second convention. And so one of the reasons that Madison was converted to a supporter of the Bill of Rights was because increasingly anti-federalists at the time were proposing a second convention to consider the issue of amendments. And Madison knew that once the convention was brought back into session, everything that they had accomplished in the convention itself was in danger of being lost. So his conversion to becoming a supporter of the Bill of Rights was principally driven by the political realities of the time. To risk a convention, he felt, was a risk that he and other Federalists were unwilling to take. And so consequently, that particular approach to amending the Constitution has never been used. Mark Levin makes the point in his conversations about his book and in the book itself, suggesting, and I think this is very important because it's not only important in and of itself, but it suggests something even, I think, more revealing. The general approach, the general suggestion that Mark Levin makes is that amendment of the Constitution was initially conceived as a top-down approach. That amendments beginning with and being refined within the central government, within the Congress of the United States and the Senate, would be the amendments that were safest and potentially less damaging to the system as a whole. And so Mark Levin's suggestion is that originally Article 5 suggested an amendment process that began with Congress, 2/3 of both houses, and then went down for ratification to 3/4 of the states, which is the way all of our amendments heretofore have been debated and approved. If you read Madison's notes, if you read the debates of the convention, it becomes very clear that exactly the opposite is true. That the first recommendation, first of all, I think it's important to recognize, I think we mentioned this last week, is that the issue of amending the Constitution doesn't even come up until the 10th of September. By that time, a good portion of the negotiation and the compromising has been done. The document is beginning to take shape. It's at that point that Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts raises the issue of amendment, of fixing the Constitution once it begins and once it becomes clear that there are certain things that need to be fixed. And his recommendation is to fix those amendments. And Madison and the other Federalists quickly realized that if amendments are to come from the states only, then this makes the security and stability of the new central government under the Constitution risky at best. And so Madison and the other Federalists proposed the second approach to ratification, which is the top-down approach. They don't suggest it as an alternative to the two-thirds of the states calling a convention. They leave that there, but they offer this as an addition to, as an alternative way. I believe, knowing full well that it's the way that it's the strategy that most likely is going to be used. But they don't remove the other option, because to do so would inflame the states. And after all, in order to get the Constitution ratified, they have to have the approval of at least 9 states, according to the rules agreed to at the convention. So if they're going to get 9 states to ratify, then they've got to be very careful not to alienate the states. And one way to do that would be to eliminate the approach to amending the Constitution, which suggests that it could begin with the states. So by leaving it in there, it becomes a political weapon, if you will, to convince the states that their interests are being protected in the new government. So what they see is an Article 5 which offers 2 ways to propose amendments and 2 ways to ratify them. Realistically, of course, only one is going to work. But now we've reached the point where the other way is very, very close to being implemented, and that's what prompts Mark Levin's book. It's obvious that what has changed from the 18th century more than anything else is the technology associated with communication. Communication, the social networking that exists now, makes it possible to organize a national move like this, which is happening in state after state, on a level which Madison and the founders never conceived possible. Technology and communication in the 21st century has reached a point right now where many of the safeguards and protections and securities that the founders believed would forever shield the Constitution from drastic overhaul and change are suddenly suspect as to whether they'll continue to work. And that's what we're dealing with here. The Second Amendment is entitled An Amendment to Restore the Senate. The very wording of it, an amendment to restore the Senate, suggests that the Senate that the founders intended has been lost and replaced by the Senate that we have now. And so this is an effort to go back to the original intent of the founders, when the senators from each state were to be chosen by state legislatures rather than elected by the people of the states. So here's Section 1 of Mark Levin's proposed Second Amendment. Section 1. The 17th Amendment is hereby repealed. The 17th Amendment is the amendment that allows the people to vote for their United States senators as well as for their representatives in Congress. And up until that amendment was approved, the 17th Amendment, during the so-called Progressive era early in the 20th century, members of the Senate were chosen by their state legislatures. This amendment would restore that original strategy. The 17th Amendment is hereby repealed. All senators shall be chosen by their state legislatures as prescribed by Article 1 of the Constitution. In other words, we would go back to the original Constitution. Section 2. This amendment shall not be so construed as to affect the term of any senator chosen before it becomes valid as part of the Constitution. So in other words, if this amendment were to be ratified, Mark Levin is suggesting here in Section 2, we would not immediately go in and fire all the senators that have been elected for their terms. There would be a process whereby a third of the senators would be removed each year. And this is Section 3. When vacancies occur in the representation of any state in the Senate for more than 90 days, the governor of the state shall appoint an individual to fill the vacancy for the remainder of the term. That happens during the death or the illness of a senator who's unable to serve. We had that experience here in West Virginia a few years ago when Senator Robert C. Byrd passed away. And our governor at that time, Joe Manchin, who's now the senator that holds that seat that Senator Byrd held in the United States Senate, Governor Manchin appointed a replacement to fill out Senator Byrd's term until there could be an election. And, of course, there was an election, and Governor Manchin himself was a candidate for the office, and he was elected to the United States Senate. Section 4 of this amendment. A senator may be removed from office by a two-thirds vote of the state legislature. Let me go back to that amendment again. There are 3 sections to it. The way you restore the Senate is by, first of all, abolishing or repealing the 17th Amendment, which gives the people the right to directly elect this senator. Second, Section 2, you are not suggesting here wholesale elimination of current senators. That what passage of this amendment would be to initiate an orderly process of gradual implementation. And when vacancies occur prior to an election, then the governor of the state would appoint someone to fill the vacancy until election time came around for the remainder of the term. And then finally, a senator could be removed from office by a two-thirds vote of the state legislature. This amendment clearly would restore the original intent of the founders, which suggests that the members of the House of Representatives, the members of Congress, would represent the people of their congressional districts, whereas the 2 senators would represent the state rather than the people of the state. And that reality is one of the things that Mark Levin and many of the conservatives today believe has gone wrong with the current United States Senate. And so term limits would affect it, would affect who sits there and who doesn't, who can run for re-election and who can't. But probably the most dramatic, besides repealing the 17th Amendment, the most dramatic part of this amendment would be that state legislatures, two-thirds of a state legislature, could override a senator by removing him from office. So in other words, if the senator was not voting exactly as prescribed by the state legislature, that senator would be removed and replaced by someone who would take their marching orders from the state legislature. Again, let me suggest that these amendments were not created in a vacuum. They are created within the political context that we find ourselves living in today. The fact of the matter is, conservative Republicans have effectively already taken control of 26 states of our 50. So in reality, what passage of this amendment would do would be to effectively emasculate the power of the United States Senate by restoring its power to the states which sent them. The mere fact that in Section 2, this amendment makes specific reference to the fact that nobody should construe this amendment as to affect the term of a senator already chosen before it becomes valid as part of the Constitution. I would suggest the mere inclusion of that suggests that that probably is indeed what the thinking is. It would totally alter the structure of government and the relationship of government that currently exists between the states and the central government. Again, the implementation here is that the state legislatures represent the interests of their people, of the citizens of those states. So therefore, the state legislatures' right to remove a senator, in theory, in the abstract, is based on the decision of the people of the state to remove the senator because the senator is not voting in accord with the way the people of that state want that particular senator to vote. But I would suggest to you that the political realities of today's world are substantially different than that. We are talking about a situation where those of a particular ideological bent have successfully taken over one state after the other. And so in reality, it would not be the people of the state that we would be hearing from. It would be the interest groups that control the members of the state legislature. They literally would be taking control of the United States Senate by removing senators who would not vote according to the will of the legislature, which means the will of those who are dictating the way the members of the state legislature vote. Because as we know, candidates for the United States Senate today spend millions to get elected to the United States Senate. And the amount of money, tens of millions of dollars, that is pouring into states who are engaged in political campaigns for election of members of the United States Senate, these have become national targets for national groups whose interest and whose money is being used to literally seek to purchase, to buy these elections. It's important to know that. And it's important to recognize that the decisions being made within a state in terms of electing senators has in many cases been hijacked by the amount of out-of-state money that's pouring into these states and affecting these local campaigns. And the Supreme Court of the United States in Citizens United in 2010 allowed this to happen. And the Supreme Court right now is hearing an additional case which is going to remove caps on individual and group contributions to election campaigns, which is opening up the election of the representatives of our states in the United States Senate to those that can pay the most price. The implication here is the voters of the states are not controlling the members of the state legislature. The sources of the money which is allowing these people to get elected are really calling the shots. So in today's world, the implementation of Amendment Number 2 would effectively restore decision-making power from the Senate of the United States back to the legislature of the state, but in reality the power would be exercised by the people who control these state legislatures. It sounds terrible, but we live in this world and we know what we're talking about. And I would suggest that this is very real. Amendment Number 3, an amendment to establish term limits for Supreme Court justices and supermajority legislative override. 2 parts. An amendment to establish term limits for Supreme Court justices and supermajority legislative overrides. Section 1. No person may serve as Chief Justice or an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court for more than a combined total of 12 years. This is a direct repudiation of Article 3 of the Constitution of the United States. This by people who claim that they seek to enact the system that the founders created. In the previous amendment, by repealing the 17th Amendment, the proposal is to go back to the thinking of the founders. But in this amendment, the thinking is to refute the thinking of the founders and to replace it with the thinking of those who are currently orchestrating this agenda. What we are witnessing here then, between Article 2, between Amendment 2 and Amendment 3, is a classic case of political speak, of political speak, or whatever you want to call it. When the situation seems to promise positive things to those who are orchestrating this, we will go back to the original intent of the founders. But when going back to the original intent of the founders contradicts what we want to accomplish, we will refute the thinking of the founders. Effectively, what that means is that the founders are not driving this at all. This is the political agenda of a well-financed, well-organized group whose purpose is to take over control of the government of the United States of America. And proof of the pudding is in the way they treat the founders. I'm thinking of Justice Scalia and originalism and going back to the original thinking of the founders. But only when it suits us. If going back to the original intent of the founders doesn't suit us, then we don't want to go back there. And here we have a classic example of this. We're going to repeal the 17th Amendment because we want the states to control the United States Senate, which was the original idea. Of course, the fact of the matter is we know that somebody's controlling, that interest groups are controlling the states, who in turn will control the United States Senate. So that works for us. But the original intent of the founders, which was to appoint justices to the Supreme Court for life, for good behavior, they can be impeached, but there were not term limits on their on the number of years that they can hold office. So this suggests an effort to demean the power of the Supreme Court of the United States. Let's get into the details. No, and again, we already looked at Section 1. No person can serve as Chief Justice or Associate Justice of the Supreme Court for more than a combined total of 12 years. Nobody can sit on the Supreme Court for longer than 12 years. Section 2. Immediately upon ratification of this amendment, Congress will organize the justices of the Supreme Court as equally as possible into 3 classes, with the justices assigned to each class in reverse seniority order, with the most senior justices in the earliest classes. In other words, the one that will been there the longest will go first. The terms of office for the justices of the first class will expire at the end of the 4th year following the ratification of this amendment. The terms for justices of the second class will expire at the end of the 8th year, and of the third class at the end of the 12th year, so that 1/3 of the justices can be chosen every 4th year. What that means is the independence of the Supreme Court from the political process, which was seen by the founders as absolutely critical to the maintaining of structural balance between the 3 branches of government. The only way that you could have an honest assessment of the Constitution and the issues surrounding constitutionality, the founders believed, was to remove these people from political pressure, from the political realities of a political world. And the only way to do that was to shield them from the waves of political interest and enthusiasm by giving them life terms. Now the decision is made the recommendation here in this amendment is to change that, to go against the thinking of the founders, and instead to render members of the Supreme Court as part of the political establishment, as part of the political process of this republic. And of course, the reality is, if you read, and there's no question, if you look at the history of the Supreme Court, there's no question that of late, the appointment of a Supreme Court justice has been increasingly a political decision. And liberal presidents tend to appoint liberal justices, conservative presidents tend to appoint conservative judges, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there are political battles over confirmation, and especially as the Supreme Court involves itself in more and more serious issues related to our contemporary society, then more and more does the makeup of the Supreme Court become a political issue. But still, members of both houses and of Congress continue to claim that the court needs to be shielded and kept separate from the political ups and downs of what's happening in the politics of the nation. This amendment moves to essentially abandon all efforts at political neutrality on the part of the court and render the court part of the political process. So that's Section 1, Section 2. Section 3 of this amendment: when a vacancy occurs in the Supreme Court, the President shall nominate a new justice who, with the approval of a majority of the Senate, shall serve the remainder of the unexpired term. Justices who fill a vacancy for longer than half of an unexpired term may not be renominated to a full term. So in other words, what you are doing is appointing adjunct justices, part-time justices, who will fill in until the next regular term begins, when we can go the same appointment process that we currently undergo, which is the role of the Senate. Section 5, and this is a part amendment as well. The congressional override under Section 4. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped Section 4. Section 4, upon 3/5 vote of the House of Representatives and the Senate, Congress may override a majority opinion rendered by the Supreme Court. Think about this. Upon 3/5 vote of the House and the Senate, 60%, the supermajority that we're currently dealing with now in the Senate, Congress may override a majority opinion rendered by the Supreme Court. In effect, what this means is that every decision of the Supreme Court would be open to politicizing the decision. And given the changes that were going to happen to the House and to the Senate, restoring the Senate was number 2, term limits for the House was number 1, you would have a totally different makeup of the House of Representatives and the Senate from what you have today, and 3/5 of the membership of both of these houses would have the power to override every decision of the Supreme Court, potentially, which would render the Supreme Court inert. Its role in our political process would effectively be emasculated. And Section 5 builds on that. The congressional override under Section 4 is not subject to a presidential veto and shall not be the subject of litigation or review in any federal or state court. Once 2/3 of both houses speak on a decision of the Supreme Court, it is irrefutable. The president can't veto it, and no court can review it. It is, in essence, surrendering power and decision-making to a two-thirds vote of both houses. And again, we're talking about houses with congressmen who have been elected from carefully gerrymandered districts, which would effectively eliminate tens of thousands of people from having any access to the political process at all. Everything we know about in terms of Republican government would be gone. This would be government of special interests who are generating the kind of money which can buy influence in legislatures, and these legislatures would seize control over members of the Senate, over members of the court, over the decisions of the court, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I would suggest to you there's no way that this does not constitute revolution. But the debate will never happen in an electorate where people don't understand the issues. And, of course, that gets back to our education system and all the rest of it. The next section. Upon 3/5 vote of the several state legislatures, the states may override a majority opinion rendered by the Supreme Court. 3/4 of the states can override a majority opinion rendered by the Supreme Court, which means that the Supreme Court no longer has the power to interpret the Constitution of the United States. The states do. And again, We're not talking about the federal system that the founders were debating. We're talking about state governments that have been gerrymandered and have effectively been taken over by an aggressive minority, which we identify in large part with the Tea Party. But in effect, I would suggest to you the Tea Party are the candidates that these gerrymandered districts have put up for election. They aren't the decision makers. They are puppets. Section 7. The state's override under Section 6 shall not be the subject of litigation or review in any federal or state court, or oversight or interference by Congress or the President. Nobody has the power to thwart the decision of 3/5 of state legislatures who override a majority opinion of the Supreme Court. Effectively, our mixed, balanced system of separation of powers will be gone. Section 8, congressional or state override authority under Sections 4 and 6 must be exercised no later than 24 months from the date of the Supreme Court rendering its majority opinion, after which date Congress and the states are prohibited from exercising the override. In other words, when the Supreme Court makes a decision, a majority decision, if it's not overturned by the states within 2 years, it becomes an accepted interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. So in other words, state legislatures have 2 years to override, to review and override and oversee every single decision of the Supreme Court of the United States. If you aren't concerned yet, then stay tuned. We are at 40 minutes after the hour. We've got a little bit less than 20 minutes to go. The next two amendments to limit federal spending and taxing. This is clearly in line with the idea of balancing the budget and getting a handle on deficit spending and all the rest of it. Section 1, on spending. Congress shall adopt a preliminary fiscal year budget no later than the first Monday in May. For the following fiscal year, and submit said budget to the President for consideration. Section 2. Shall Congress fail to adopt a final fiscal year budget prior to the start of each fiscal year, which shall commence on October 1st of each year, and shall the President fail to sign said budget into law, an automatic across-the-board 5% reduction in expenditures from the prior year's fiscal budget shall be imposed for the fiscal year in which a budget has not been adopted. In other words, if we find ourselves in a situation where there is not a budget at the beginning of the fiscal year, then Congress is required to reduce spending for that year by 5% of the previous budget that existed. So it's going to spur the creation of federal budgets. But the reality is, it kind of suggests, and you've got to look at these in light of the other amendments as well. Each of these amendments is not considered in isolation. They're all part of a pack. Sin 3. Total outlays of the full government for a fiscal year exceed its receipts for that fiscal year. Government cannot spend beyond its income. And of course we hear this all the time. Paul Ryan and everybody else, we know what this be. You know, in my family, I can't spend more than I've got in my checkbook. Government shouldn't have the right to do that either. And Section the outlays of the federal government for each fiscal year shall not exceed 17.5% of the nation's gross domestic product for the previous calendar year. In other words, government every year cannot spend more than 17.5% of the nation's gross domestic product. So therefore, the autonomous behavior of Congress in developing budgets is pretty well going to be taken away and replaced by a series of caps and limitations. Once you know the gross national product for the previous year, then what you are saying to Congress is, as you prepare your spending for the next year, you are limited to 17.5% of this number, which was the gross domestic product for last year. And then whatever decision-making you have, decision-making authority or prerogative you have, will be within the context of that reality. Section 5 of this spending amendment. Total receipts shall include all receipts of the United States government, but shall not include those derived from borrowing. Total outlays shall include all outlays of the United States government except those for the repayment of debt principal. What this section effectively does is eliminate deficit spending. Government cannot spend more than it takes in, which is going to mean the decimation of the federal government as we know it. And, of course, that's going to include Social Security and Medicare and Obamacare and everything else. And there's more to the spending amendment. Section 6. Congress may provide for a one-year suspension of one or more of the preceding sections in this article by a 3/5 vote of both houses of Congress, provided the vote is conducted by roll call and sets forth the specific excess of outlays over receipts or outlays over 17.5% of the nation's gross domestic product. In other words, it doesn't forbid Congress from exceeding these caps, but it suggests that whenever government is proposing something that does exceed them, they have to go back and take a 3/5 vote by roll call. In other words, every member of Congress needs to basically go on record and vote. So it can't be by voice vote or anything like that. Section 7. The limit on the debt of the United States held by the public shall not be increased unless 3/5 of both houses of Congress shall provide for such an increase by roll call vote. Again, an effort to limit, control government spending. And finally, Section 8 of this spending amendment. This amendment shall take effect in the 4th fiscal year after its ratification. Congress has 4 years, or 3 years, to figure out how to make this work. So effectively, spending limits and the effort to reduce the size of the federal government is on the table with these amendments. And the only time that government spending can exceed these caps, these limitations, is by special request and roll call vote. That's the spending side. Now the taxing side. Section 1. Congress shall not collect more than 15% of a person's annual income from whatever source derived. Person shall include natural and legal persons. Please focus on this one. In taxes, Congress cannot collect more than 15% of a person's annual income, and person shall include natural and legal persons, corporations. 15%. Of course, with the limitations you've imposed, the thinking is that Congress will be so limited in what it can spend anyway that it won't need more than 15%. But it is imperative to recognize that while this seems to be attractive because it makes a maximum of 15% tax on a person's income, that's very appealing. But the fact of the matter is it also imposes 15% maximum on corporate income as well. In the Eisenhower years, in the 1950s, corporations were being taxed in excess of 90%. And still, the United States productive capacity became the most dominant economy in the world, even when as much as 90% plus was being paid in taxes. That number has gone all down, as we know, to today. The number that's thrown around is 37% as a max. Most people who make fairly good middle-class incomes in this society pay at the rate of 30% on their taxes. This would half that. Now, of course, we know from the last presidential election that Mitt Romney pays less than the 15% identified here now through loopholes. So those people who have the power and the money and the influence and the legal advice can find ways to escape the bulk of their responsibility to give back to society at large. But the passage of this amendment will essentially lock in that 15% maximum for corporate America. And of course the argument will be that that will allow American corporations to become much more competitive in competing with productivity, with production in other parts of the world. So in other words, it's government support for America's competitiveness. Section 2 of this taxing amendment. The deadline for filing federal income tax returns shall be the day before the date set for elections to federal office. Think about this. The deadline for filing your federal income tax will be the day before you vote for federal office holders, which means chances are many people are not going to go into the election, into the polling place with a smile on their faces because they've just paid their income taxes the day before. Section 3, Congress shall not collect tax on a decedent's estate. Congress shall not collect taxes on a decedent's estate. That means that the so-called estate tax will be abolished. And there's been a big debate during the Obama administration, as you know, about the estate tax. This would abolish it, which would mean that the multimillionaires would be allowed to pass on to future generations within their own family tax-free. Section 4, Congress shall not institute a value-added tax or national sales tax or any other tax in kind or form. Under the Articles of Confederation, the states could tax, but the central government could not. Under this amendment, we go back to that. Congress shall not institute a value-added tax or a national sales tax. In other words, Congress will not have the authority to raise money in any other way other than what's prescribed here. And finally, Section 5, this amendment shall take effect the 4th fiscal year after its ratification. We have 4 minutes left in today's program before Bob Kincaid comes on here at on the Head On Radio Network. I'm going to stop there. I don't know that I need to summarize or to bring all of this together, but it's very obvious that the conservative agenda, which we have been exposed to for several years in pieces, is all together right here. This is the agenda, and conservative Republicans are woefully close to what they need in order to call a constitutional convention, which puts all of these amendments together on the table at the same time. I would suggest to you that if you think about all of these amendments as a package, just the ones we've covered so far, we'll go back and touch on the others tomorrow. But if you consider the amendments that have already been addressed as a package, then I would suggest to you that the assurances we receive from Mark Levin and those who have written support articles for this approach, and there are many, the assurances that this would not be a runaway convention, which would put everything back on the table, becomes a sham. I would suggest to you that if just the amendments that we've already touched upon today are on the table at the same time, the system that the founders created is effectively emasculated. Going in, one would think that we would be going to witness originalism. We were going to go back to the thinking of the founders. But what we've seen instead is that when going back to the founders works for these folks, they endorse it. But when it doesn't, they reject it. So consequently, the Second Amendment is to restore the Senate that the founders created by allowing the state legislatures to elect the senators rather than the people of the states. That works for these folks. But the next amendment on the Supreme Court, it doesn't work because the founders believed that the only way that you can have an honest rendering of the court system is to remove the justices from the political ebb and flow of politics and of political pressure by giving them life appointments and rendering the Supreme Court separate from the political process. The amendments proposed here would bring the Supreme Court into the political process in much, much greater degree than it is today. We know how much political pressure there is associated with the appointment of a member of the Supreme Court. A judicial appointment by a president is big stuff in today's world. We know that. The fight over Robert Bork, the fight over Justice Kagan, and the idea that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is going to be leaving. There's all sorts of talk about when she might leave, and she's assuring us that her health is such that she plans on fulfilling her term this term and all the rest of it. But she's reached an age right now where, and so has many of the other justices on the court, where a change is in the offing. This would essentially emasculate the independence and the political neutrality of the Supreme, even the illusion of independence and political neutrality. What all of this would do would bring the entire political process of this republic under the control of the financial interests who are behind this movement. I think it's time to call today a day. It's 59 minutes after the hour. Bob Kincaid will follow here on the Head On Radio Network. I'm Bill O'Brien. Please join us again tomorrow. Thank you so much for being with us. I hope we've provided food for thought. I know from my perspective, we sure have. Thank you so much. Be safe. We want you to be back. Thank you.